Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puka, Religious Studies PhD, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. And today, a little bit of folklore as well, although it's something that it's also part of the topics that I address in my symposium. Before we dive in with our special guest today, I'd like to remind you that Angela's Symposium is a crowd-funded project. So if you have the means and want to help this project going and allow everybody to access academic peer-reviewed knowledge in the topics that I cover on the channel, please consider supporting my work with a one-off PayPal donation by joining memberships, my inner symposium on Patreon. There's also the option of coffee now. So you find all the options in the info box, show notes, in the bio, everywhere. So thank you all for considering. Thank you to Andrew, Edward, and Joao for moderating the chat. And let's bring on our guest today. So today we have Icy Sedgwick. Have I pronounced your surname correctly?
It's Sedgwick, but I know that that's
Sedgwick.
obviously depends whether you've got that collection of letters or not.
Yeah. So thank you so much for accepting to be on my show on Angela's Symposium. And we have as the moderator Andrew, the one that actually introduced me to your work. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive in?
I'm doing a PhD in haunted house films. Yes, that's the thing. People always ask that. And I also run a folklore podcast and have basically become like a folklore researcher / writer, kind of by accident over about the last 6 years now, I think. So my focus is usually Northern European folklore, just because that's where I am. But that kind of takes in all sorts of stuff, including ghost stories, fairies, like local legends, superstitions, and even urban legends occasionally, although they're not necessarily my favorite.
Mm. And what got you into studying this for your PhD?
For my PhD was I did how do I put it? Basically, I'd done something kind of similar for my MA dissertation because I'd looked at the uncanny in like domestic spaces, and then I wanted to do a PhD, and I was like, oh well, I'll do the haunted house element because I had been doing sort of female monsters as well, so films like Carrie and stuff like that. And then I was like, oh, actually, I'm more interested in the ghost side of things. And then it's changed a fair bit, as they sometimes do, over the amount of time and number of supervisors that I've had. And I'm very specifically looking at sort of haunted houses in American cinema, sort of from Amityville Horror onwards. And I'm looking at them less in terms of what they represent spectrally, because there's a really big thing in Gothic studies in particular of looking at things as metaphors, which is fine, and there's some really awesome stuff being done like that. But I'm also like, yeah, but it's also a film. So my main point of focus is looking at how hauntings or ghosts and demonic entities and so on are created using like the language of cinematography or set design and sound design as well. So it's like, how do these technologies of cinema actually contribute to making ghosts and so on? And if I had more space, I would probably also have included costume and makeup as well. But that's possibly a rabbit hole I don't have time to fall down at this stage.
Is it a practice-led PhD?
No, it's all
Okay.
sort of theory led. But I had to like learn like all the terminology and so on. So it's oh, it just froze there. A lot of my theorists are actually sort of actually practitioners, so it is cinematographers and sound theorists and people like that. So it's quite nice to yes include theory, but also to include the people who actually make the films in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does it intersect with your project online, with your podcast and your interest in folklore and pagan themes?
It's mostly the ghosts end of the spectrum. So where obviously a lot of folklore can include ghost stories, and I know some people don't include ghosts as part of folklore, and I think that that's a great shame. It's it has been quite useful because of the fact that you then start spotting elements in, say, set design and so on, or parts of the way that the films are made that you kind of then see coming from folklore. So really sort of standard example in some films is, and actually no, I'll just stick to one, The Conjuring in particular. There's a whole big thing about like the fireplaces in the house where they're just kind of like they're in the background in the set design, but they've all been used for something else. And there's obviously all the stuff in folklore about people blocking, or I should say blocking fireplaces using things like apotropaic marks and things like that, and other devices or practices to try and prevent evil from entering the home through the fireplace, which obviously I always think is quite funny when you then get to, you know, popular belief about things like Santa Claus, but that's that's just my own personal giggle.
And what brought you to start your fabulous folklore podcast? And I think you also have a YouTube channel, so people go check it out. I can already see that Andrew has posted it in the chat.
Oh, cool. It was really an accident because I'd been blogging about folklore, sort of as part of the Folklore Thursday hashtag on Twitter. I refuse to call it X, and it was obviously I've been putting the blog post up, and then I was reading a book about marketing, and it was like, oh, once you get to a certain point, you should like diversify what you're doing, and if you're doing like written, add video or audio or something. So I thought, oh well, you know, for accessibility reasons, I'll record like an audio version of the blog post, and put that in the blog post itself. And then I thought, just for a laugh, one day I uploaded the RSS feed to iTunes as it was then, and it was like, oh, now you've got a podcast. So I was kind of like, oh, okay. So I just sort of started podcasting kind of by accident, and then I added YouTube more recently. So that's literally just putting the audio episodes on YouTube though, because it's too much at the moment to actually create like entire videos every single week. But I mean, so many people listen to podcasts through YouTube now anyway. I think there's an entire feature for that now. So it just, again, just gives people an extra point of entry. And one of the things I like about having the episodes on YouTube is the fact that people can comment directly underneath. And there isn't really an option for that on other platforms for podcasts. Like you can leave comments on Spotify, but I can't respond to them. So you can't get that dialogue going in the comments in the same way that you can on YouTube. So I do think that the YouTube podcast feature is actually quite helpful, because I've never wanted Fabulous Folklore to just be me talking. I've always wanted to kind of have audience participation, for want of a better word. So it's been really nice for the last couple of episodes that I've done for people to actually tell me the folklore they know on that subject. So it's like literally collecting primary research and then sort of sharing that, rather than just relying on the same old sources that everybody else has already got.
Yes, absolutely. So entering now the realm of paganism and folklore. So how do you think that folklore informs pagan practices? And I'm talking more specifically about contemporary paganism, because I know that there's a whole conversation about also pre-Christian forms of paganism, which, you know, I'm at the moment I'm editing a book on paganism, and there's been a whole discussion about historical paganism is not capitalized, whereas contemporary paganism gets capitalized. So how do you think that folklore informs and affects contemporary paganism and pagan practices?
I think in some ways folklore can give you a nice place to start, in the sense that if you just want to kind of get started with like ordinary everyday practices, shall we say, so not like big massive rituals or anything like that. There's so many little bits and pieces in folklore, like particular herbs that you might have around your house, or something really basic like putting a horseshoe over your door, something like that. And it in a way, I think that sort of helps to not legitimize, that's the wrong word, but it sort of helps to kind of anchor your practice in a sense that this is something that people have done previously, because I think there is that issue, particularly with some of the reconstructed traditions and so on, where that because a lot of these sort of forms, well, that's branches of paganism, shall we say, some of them are reconstructed because we don't know what people did that far ago because there aren't records. So where people have reconstructed them, I sort of feel like folklore helps you kind of fill in the gaps a little bit because that has been collected and has been documented. That in it of itself also poses problems, but I think it does just kind of give you an idea what actual people were doing, rather than, if you look at like the Order of the Golden Dawn or something, and they're kind of off doing their own magical thing, and it's perhaps not as accessible as some of the other practices. And I think that's where, if you look at, for example, like a lot of the folklore around particularly home protection, you can see echoes of it even if you go back to sort of some of the Roman sources, because at least they're really helpful and wrote a lot of stuff down. And you can see how these things that are essentially like ordinary people's beliefs can then help to underpin different pagan practices in a way that I think is helpful, but sometimes gets co-opted in the wrong way.
What do you mean in the wrong way?
I think it's more specific things. So it's things like when you look at Clouty Wells, so people were back in the past would take like a length of fabric from something that would biodegrade, because that's what they had in those days, and they would, if I remember correctly, it depends on the well really, but generally speaking, you would kind of bind that around the affected thing that you were trying to heal. Then you would dip it in the water and then tie it to the tree, and then as the piece of fabric rotted away, it should take your illness with it, which is a nice practice in a lot of ways. But then you look at modern Clouty trees and people are hanging up nylon and polyester and rayon and all these fabrics that famously don't biodegrade, and in some cases it's damaging the tree, in other cases it's just making the area sort of look, I don't want to say untidy, but it just kind of, people are wanting to join in with the tradition, but not necessarily with the actual practice that underpinned it in the first place. And then it ends up kind of, becoming this whole other thing, which wasn't really what the original intention was. I guess it's a bit like when you sort of, there's been news stories in the papers recently about people like setting fires at Bronze Age circles and stuff. And it's just kind of like, why? Like, what were people hoping to achieve by like destroying an ancient site? Like, that's what I mean, where I think sometimes people can then sometimes take these things that are ancient practices, and then if they just kind of take the bit that they like out of it, it sort of creates a set of practices which end up being a little bit more damaging than I think the people themselves maybe even realize that they are.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it also seems like folklore for many people is a gateway into paganism in a way, or into pagan beliefs and practices. Speaking of which, I think that my understanding is that you are interested in otherworldly beings, if we can call them like fairies and ghosts. And can you tell us a bit more about those, and how do you feel they intersect both folklore and paganism, and whether there's a difference between how these are seen and interpreted, and the beliefs around them, and even the practice around them in the folklore as opposed to contemporary paganism, if there is an opposition?
It's funny because I think in some ways there's so much lovely crossover and they overlap in quite a lot of really interesting ways. So if you look at quite a lot of the stories of, for example, boggarts, which, they're kind of like the brownie gone bad, as it were. So obviously if you have a boggart in your house, and they're kind of, they're famous for messing everything up. And if you leave things tidy, they'll put them in disarray and so on. And obviously you've got crossover from them with things like poltergeists and whatnot. So I sort of feel like I often wonder if we're actually talking about the same things, but just with different names, particularly when you look at some of the older sort of like fairy encounters almost. It's kind of like, and then people have sort of discussions about other spirits that they might have encountered and so on. They do all end up sounding quite similar, and there's quite a lot of lovely crossover, I think, between certain types of fairy and ghosts, like grey ladies and white ladies and things like that. So I do think that there is some use in categorizing them. So you've got like fairies, ghosts, demonic beings, although that's starting to get into a grey area, I think. But then what's really interesting is how many people in contemporary paganism then take quite like some of these sort of spiritual beings and then actually work with them as part of their practice. So I'm thinking here of the people who sort of work with fairies and so on, which like to anyone who sort of like looked at like the original folklore about fairies is kind of like, oh, I wouldn't be so keen on doing that. Fairies in folklore aren't really famous for necessarily being particularly helpful to humans. But then people have sort of taken the parts of the fairy lore that work for them and then created this whole form of practice because that's how they encounter these particular beings or this particular part of the environment, which is really cool. And I think you also get mythological creatures turn up in these kind of guises as well. Like dragons are a particularly famous one. And I've seen quite a lot of stuff recently about people wanting to develop practices with sort of like mermaids and water spirits and things like that. So it is really interesting how folklore kind of provides this cast of characters or archetypes and so on that people can then engage with in a more practical way, I think, through different paganism paths, if that's the right term. But I think this is one of the advantages of paganism as a whole, because of the fact that there's no one single dogma. You can approach it in a way that sort of suits you. And then, of course, you've got other people, and quite a lot of people that I know actually are engaged in like spirit work and do quite a lot of things sort of with ancestral spirits or even encountering the dead in different forms and either helping them or whatever they need to do for that particular spirit to generally feel a little bit happier. So I think it's interesting how all of these different aspects of folklore do appear in modern practice. And I think it ends up creating a nice engagement with the wider environment as well, in a way that I think you might not otherwise have, sort of without that belief system in place.
Can you expand a bit more on how fairies are seen in the folklore? Are you referring to the British folklore, by the way? Mostly,
yes. So I'm thinking particularly in a lot of the English folklore that I know obviously better. It's the likes of, you get really famous story types, and I know that some of these do appear elsewhere around the British Isles as well, and no doubt I would imagine in Europe as well. The tale of the fairy midwife being quite a famous one, and it's not the midwife that's the fairy, but it's like an ordinary midwife who's called usually in the middle of the night to a location that she doesn't recognize, and she's there to deliver a baby, and she's supposed to anoint the baby's eyes with this ointment when she gets there, but she's not supposed to let her touch her own. And for some reasons, usually by accident, she rubs her eye or something like that and ends up with this ointment on her eye. And then she can then actually see that the person that she's dealing with is not actually this rich woman in a wealthy house or whatever. It's actually a fairy in a cave or something like that. And she doesn't let on, and then she goes back to her. She's paid for our job, so you know that's all good. The fairies pay her. She goes back to her life, and then she inadvertently lets on that she's seen one of the fairies in her ordinary life, usually at a market. And then, because of the fact that they realise they've been seen, they invariably blow into her face and actually blind her, either in both eyes or just the one with the ointment on. And I always kind of look at stories like that, and I'm just like, yeah, I wouldn't cross them. I'd quite happily like leave them be. And then, of course, you've got the legends of changelings as well, of this idea of fairies swapping like a human baby for one of theirs. And again, that doesn't, to me, necessarily scream benevolence. Although, again, I think because you can divide fairies into so many different types, and indeed Catherine Briggs did in her Encyclopedia of Fairies, I think that it's probably not that helpful of me to kind of lump them all into one category.
Yeah, that's also fair. And are there different types of fairies in the English folklore?
So many of them. It's really interesting because you end up with everything from like the will-o'-the-wisp, which there'll be a variation of. I'm going to hazard a guess and say pretty much all over Europe. And then you've got sort of fairies like the knockers that you get in Cornwall, but you also get them in the Northeast and in America. and they're the ones who make noises in mines. Sometimes the folklore has them as warning miners of impending disaster. Other people have said, oh no, they're knocking because they're going to create a cave-in, but most people tend towards them being there to warn people. So they're at least helpful. And then, of course, you've got the likes of your brownies who will tidy your house if you've left it untidy and then mess it up if you haven't, and so on. And the ones who kind of work hard doing chores around the house at night, as long as you don't give them a gift of anything, and then they'll leave. So there's quite a few like that. But then you go into the realms of like the fairy animals, for want of a better description. So you have your black dog spirits, and I suppose probably, are we going to call it a fairy? Yeah, the Kelpie would probably be the one most people might have come across, and that's the water horse. And again, these appear all over Europe with different names, where if you see this just horse kind of grazing near water and then you touch it, you kind of almost get sort of stuck to it, or if you climb on its back, you then can't get off again, and it just drags you into water and drowns you. So again, it's kind of like not very nice. So you do get this huge sort of spectrum of fairy-like creatures that some of them like humans, some of them don't, and some of them seem completely indifferent. So it just depends kind of which sort of piece of lore you're looking at.
Is there a motivation as to why they mess about with people's things and lives?
It's difficult to tell. I think with the brownies, there's so many different brownie stories that in some cases they've somehow like become attached to the family. So the family almost kind of passes them down. Some of the stories try to claim that they actually like helping and they like doing jobs around the house because it sort of makes them feel useful. I don't know how much I buy that one, or if that's just people trying to make themselves feel better about it. But I think it's difficult trying to sort of assign motivation to anything fairies do, because in a lot of the folklore they do seem to just pretty much please themselves, which is why some of them will be mischievous and play tricks just because they find it funny. And then you kind of go, well, you know, there's people who are like that. So I suppose, you know, they are weirdly human in that way, and that sometimes they don't have a motivation. But then there's other ones where you get, say, the Banshee, for example, and she has a very specific job to do. So her role is to announce a death, usually in a specific family, and then she kind of passes down through the family as well. So that's just literally what she does. So I think it is quite interesting that some of them, literally what they do is just because that's what their role is for. And then other ones like brownies, it just seems to depend on the story that was collected at the time as to what the brownie got out of it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And thank you to Vocatus, Mark, for your donations, and thanks to Rachel for saying thanks for this great interview, Dr. Puka and Icy. We have a question from one of my patrons who says, at what point is a mythological monster not considered a fairy? Are there a set of criteria to help with the classification, or is this just decided over time?
That is a really good question. I think it seems to be, from what I can gather, there seems to just kind of eventually be just a cut-off point that anything that's sort of discussed in ancient sources tends to be more mythological, and then anything that's kind of more recent, and by recent I mean, you know, you're still talking a few centuries. So if you look at something like the unicorn, for example, Pliny talks about them, and I'm convinced Pliny is describing a rhinoceros. That's my absolute belief, that he's talking about a rhinoceros. And you get things like the manticore and things. So yeah, it's a very good question actually, because then I look at other things, like we've got some dragon stories in the northeast, and they're called worms. So they're these great long serpent-like dragons, and they're not considered mythological, but they're not really considered fairies either. They're just monstrous. So it's kind of that is a really good question. That there almost seems to be three categories of mythological, monstrous, and fairy. But I think it possibly is just a question of when the story was collected as to which bucket it kind of sits in.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether your question, Arcane Whiskers, is about what's the difference between something being considered folklore and something being considered mythological. And if that is the question, I would say that something that is folklore is very unstructured and it is living and breathing, and something that is mythological is historical and is usually part of a corpus. It's part of a narrative, a wider narrative. So in mythology, you often have pantheons, you have a whole backstory and theogony and genealogy, whereas folklore is very much a mess. So it's not as it is not as structured, it's not as tidied up. It's like people. I mean, people have different beliefs, and you will find that a specific entity may be described from a person in a way and another person in another way, because since it is something very living and breathing that people are still engaging with, it changes all the time. It's very malleable, it's not structured. So I think that's the difference that I would see between folklore and mythology. I'm not sure that it is a super accurate answer, but it's my perception. Would you
I
agree
think
on
one
that,
thing I would
Isaac?
add to that as well is mythology, they tend to be like, they're almost fixed. So over time, like you get like a description of a dragon or a griffin, and that's what it becomes. Whereas if you look at folklore, I mean, it can vary just simply going down the road. So from one village to the next, they'll have a slightly different version of something. So yeah, it is incredibly messy. You are correct in that one, and it's a nightmare sometimes trying to actually go, are these the same thing? They've got different names, but they kind of sound the same. Whereas with mythology, it's like, no, it's this. So it's nice and organized.
Yeah, and I'm sure that even in the history, there would be a difference between what's written in the mythology and what people actually believe and what people actually practice. That's the long-standing difference between institutionalized religions and living religions that in religious studies we talk about, and even for this is particularly prevalent for non-dogmatic religions, and paganism is of course an example. But even with religions that are dogmatic by uh, design, like the monotheisms, even in those cases, you will find that what people do and what people practice and how people talk about their religion may differ significantly from the theological stances of that specific religion and the central dogma that it gravitates around. So I think that I would imagine that even when it comes to mythology, you would probably find that people would engage with those entities, deities in a very different way. I would guess compared to what the mythology says. I was thinking about the theogony for some reason by Hesiod. Mm, but so yeah, and what about the puka, which for some reason find interesting? I actually didn't know that puka was a thing until Dr. Jenny Butler told me. You're probably familiar with her work. And she was the first one to tell me, did you know that your surname is actually Irish? Because it's funny, because in Italian it doesn't mean anything at all. And then I found out that in Ireland they have Puka Festival and it's spelled exactly the same way. I know that in the English folklore there is also the Puka, which is spelled a bit differently, but I just thought it was very interesting because in Italian it doesn't mean anything. So at least it does mean something in other languages. So yeah, could you tell us something about the Puka?
The Puka is really interesting because, again, I guarantee anyone in Northern Europe in particular will have a version in their folklore. It just may not necessarily have the same name. Obviously, I think pretty much all of the British Isles, and then plus the Channel Islands, all have a version. And I mean, I would argue like the most famous kind of example of one that people may have come across is in A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Shakespeare.
And yeah, and Shakespeare's brilliant for folklore. He really is. And a lot of the time you can kind of go, did this thing like mean anything to people? Well, it's in Shakespeare, so it must have done. And he's really good for kind of providing a record. Chaucer's good for the same as well. But with the Puka, I think they're so fascinating because they've got that shapeshifting element to them. And I think shapeshifters are always fascinating because it's that sense of not being able to necessarily trust what it is that you're looking at. But again, they've got that sense of, I can't really think off the top of my head of many stories of them where they're actively malevolent. Again, they tend to be mischievous, so they'll do something because they find it funny. So if a particular famous one that they like to do is they'll take the form of a horse, much like a kelpie, but where the similarity ends is the puka will take someone for a ride, and then just at random they'll just disappear, and then the person will basically then be left on the ground, not sitting on the horse that they thought they were riding. And we have one in the northeast called the Headley Cow, spelled Kow. And while that's not referred to specifically as a puka in a lot of the sources, it clearly is, because one of his favorite tricks was take the form of a horse and then dumping people usually into muddy puddles. And I always think there's just such like a 4-year-old's kind of idea of fun. And there's just something about them where it's very slapstick. And their intention is not to harm. People don't get hurt through their pranks. But the pukas obviously had a bit of a giggle. And then there are some stories where pukas are actually quite helpful and they pass on warnings to humans. So I kind of feel like they're such an interesting character because there's so much to them, and it does vary depending on which puka you're looking at. But because they're not actively enacting harm on anyone, again, they're just having a laugh at our expense. I sort of feel like they're a little bit like the trickster archetype, sort of, but with a little bit more anarchy going on in there. And I sort of feel like the fact that there's so many of them in so many different guises makes me think that people must have been encountering something. Because, you know, it would be a weird thing to try and rationalize otherwise. Like, imagine you came home and someone's like, why have you got mud on your trousers? For a grown person to say, oh, well, I found this horse and then it disappeared under us and I landed in a puddle, most people would just say they tripped and fell. So I kind of feel like there must have been something going on. So whether there are still pukas out there and we're just not encountering them because we're in like cars and trains and stuff, I don't know. But I love the idea that they're still just pottering about the countryside waiting for somebody to prank.
Or moving to the UK. People. I can see it in the chat. People are making jokes about that. So yeah, that's funny. So yeah, could you give us other examples of otherworldly beings in the English folklore or the folklore that you have studied?
Just in general or shapeshifters specifically?
In general, but you can elaborate on shapeshifter, definitely.
I think probably one of my personal favorites, and it kind of actually satisfies both criteria, is the Selki. I love
The
Selki
Selki.
stories. They pop up mostly in sort of around the Orkneys, but you do get them in Ireland as well, but also in like the Faroe Islands. I think there's some Norwegian ones, and also around Iceland. And they're stories of people who were believed to be able, well, not people actually, but they could take the form of seals in water, and then they could take off their seal skin and take the form of a human on land. Some of the stories vary. Sometimes they could only do this once a year, Midsummer's Eve being a big one, because you tend to get dates like Midsummer's Eve becomes really popular for a lot of folklore. And other times it's just the kind of come up onto the land because maybe they want to have a bit of, they seem to be really fond of dancing. And there's just something really joyful about the idea of that you've got these sort of seal-like creatures that live in the sea, but then they're, oh, I want to have a bit of a boogie, so they come up onto land. The downside of them for the female Selkies is that human men would often take a fancy to them, and steal their skin so they couldn't turn back into their true form, and would then force them into marriage and so on. And there's sort of some communities who would obviously kind of claim Selkie ancestry from sort of some distant past or whatever. And then there's some of the stories where once the Selkie wife finds her skin, she then returns to the sea. Sometimes she takes any children with them, sometimes she doesn't. And then there was one really nice one where, even though the marriage didn't really start under consensual terms, there must have been some kind of regard between them, because the husband's out fishing at sea and his boat gets into trouble, and the wife realizes what's happening. She puts her skin on and she actually goes out and rescues him. But because of that, she can't return to land again for 7 years. So she kind of has to more or less give up her marriage, but in order to save her husband. And you sort of think he can't have been that bad if she saved him. But then the male Selkies are really interesting because they're completely at the other end of the spectrum. Male Selkies really like seducing human women, which sounds bad, but they kind of waited almost until they were called. So you could actually call one by shedding 7 tears into the sea. And apparently dissatisfied wives were big fans of male Selkies. And sometimes people used to use them as excuses why their wife had like left them because they'd run off with a Selkie. But male Selkies do seem like they just kind of do their own kind of thing. And then they're like, oh, I quite like her. And then, give the woman a good time and then just disappear again. But there's an air of, again, sort of fun about them. But because it sort of feels like they're sort of fulfilling a need for the dissatisfied wife in a way, you sort of get the feeling that the male Selkies, A, they've kind of been used as an excuse by rubbish husbands, but B, I think there's a degree where they like respect the woman's sort of like set of desires or whatever in a way that the husband maybe doesn't. So male Selkies are really interesting, sort of compared to the female Selkies, but in both cases they seem quite positive.
I was wondering whether there was a way of perhaps hiding an affair because they were actually running away with somebody else rather than the Selkie.
Yeah, it was probably sounded better saying that your wife had run off with a Selkie than saying should run off with like your neighbor or something.
Well, seems fair enough if they were dissatisfied by the husband. So, but yeah, I actually never heard of the Selkie, so that's really interesting. So, do you think that there is something similar to the idea of the incubus and succubus because of the sexual element? I'm not sure whether there is a sexual element though, because if women were dissatisfied, were calling upon the male Selkie, would it mean that they would be satisfied by calling upon the spirit? Would it be a sexual satisfaction or just forgetting about sex?
It sounds like it probably would be. Whereas I think the other way around, because the human male is like very actively seeking out the Selkie.
Sorry, this one made me laugh. A nice way to give you performance anxiety.
I think for the female Selkies, there'll be, and you also get these stories all over the world as well, and the type of creature changes. So you get swan maidens appear in Irish lore. You've got there's bird women in Papua New Guinea, where they take the form of, I want to say cassowaries, but I could be wrong. So you get these kind of stories all over the world, and it's very much an idea of unlike, I'm trying to remember which way around it is. The succubus is the one that attacks men, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I always get them the wrong way around. And I have to work off the band incubus to remember which way around
the incubus
it is.
I think is the male and the succubus is the female.
So with those, I get the feeling you don't really get any choice in the matter if one comes to visit you. Whereas obviously when the human men choose Selkies, they actively go out and like pick the one that they want. So which sounds horrible because it is. So I think there's a bit more human agency involved in those kind of stories.
And in the case of man, they are not dissatisfied. It's not why they seek out the female Selkie.
Sometimes it kind of seems like they just they usually see them first. So they've seen that particular one on the beach and they're like, that's the one that I want. So it often sort of seems a little bit like they've just got their eye on someone and decided that's the one for me, regardless of what she thinks about it. You don't hear stories of them like befriending the Selki and wooing the Selki. It's just, I'm going to steal her skin and then she has to marry me. And you're just like, ew, that's not really a good start for anything, is it? So yeah, I think there's like almost a domination element there, I think, more than anything else.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Any other example of other worldly beings? Because this is very fascinating for me.
The other one I think I always end up picking just because I'm kind of biased because again it's another one where I am, but you get them all over the north of England, and I think you get them in other places as well. I'm sure Wales has them, but they've just got a different name, and that's the Barguest, which they're also sometimes called the Padfoot, and they get mixed up with black dog folklore quite a lot because they traditionally take the form of a black dog, and they're interesting because again they can be sometimes quite mischievous. So there's a story of one in Yorkshire, and it basically follows this guy home, but like every time he turns around, it's not there, but he can hear it behind him, and it actually even gets home before him, and then just kind of lies across his front door, sort of thing, but then disappears when his wife's coming because it's obviously scared of his wife. And again, it doesn't hurt this guy at any point. He does point out that he was leaving the pub when he saw this, and he stresses how much he wasn't drunk. So you do have to kind of go, were you a little bit drunk? But the story is quite a long one, and but again, at no point does the Barguest hurt him. It just kind of plays a couple of tricks on him, and just like freaks him out a little bit. And then you get other ones where if someone notable in the village had died, it would lead a parade, like a funeral procession of like all the dogs in the village and things like that. And generally, you just kind of let them get on with their thing, because if you interrupted them, if one of them struck you, you'd end up with a wound that would never heal. But then with some of the Barguest stories, like people are like, oh, it can take the form of a black dog and a woman in white and a headless man on fire. And I'm like, how do you know they're all the same thing? You know what I mean? So some of the stories are quite interesting. And sometimes they're considered death omen, sometimes not. Sometimes they just appear for like lone travelers, for example. Sometimes they'll accompany lone travelers and actually act almost like a guardian, particularly if they're women. Other times they just kind of like push you into a wall and then wander off, which again, it's that sort of like level of mischief that you get with some of the other ones that I think is really interesting with them. And I mean, Catherine Briggs, I think she described them as being both a ghost and like a goblin dog. So I think that they're another one that sits in that weird intersection between ghosts and fairies, which makes you think, is there actually that much of a distinction between them?
Yeah, that's interesting. We have a question from Joao, one of our moderators. Are sirens and mermaids words for the same mythical creature, or are there stories that describe creatures with each name differently?
I'm so glad this one came up because this is a pet peeve of mine. Sirens, technically, if you want to split hairs, are very specific, and they basically appear in Homer's Odyssey, because Odysseus encounters them, and they were birds with the head of women that lived on this particular island. Now, in some versions of the myth, they were actually Persephone's handmaidens, and they are given wings by Demeter to try and help find Persephone. And then when they can't, because obviously they don't know that she's in the underworld, they end up banished to this island. And the sirens, the one thing that they do have about them is they've got this beautiful singing voice, which is really sort of the thing that people know about sirens. And when they're on this island, you tend to then find that a lot of ships are lured towards it by the sound of the singing. So what Odysseus does is he has everybody on his ship stop or up their ears with wax, and then he has himself tied to the mast so he can hear it, but without trying to direct the direction of the ship. Technically speaking, being able to hear the song of the sirens and survive actually kills the sirens. but that's technically what sirens are. They're actually these human-headed birds with beautiful singing voices, and they get really hard done by in mythology. Like, they get treated really, really badly. Like, at no point have they actually done anything wrong, but they just keep getting punished for stuff that's out of their control. And people just remember them as luring sailors in. Nobody knows why their song did that. It's that one's still, I think, open to interpretation. Mermaids, on the other hand, appear in so many cultures. They're all around the world. So they all have different motivations. They all have different sort of living environments and things like that. But it was a translation error that somebody made that led someone to conflate mermaids and sirens. So the idea of mermaids then singing on rocks to lure in sailors actually came from that translation error. And it's interesting because mermaids, like, if you look at them in sort of folklore, I mean, there's a mermaid story in Cornwall, and again, she's given this beautiful singing voice, but she can actually take human form on land, and then she's got the fishtail in water. And I think that is quite interesting, because when you see old churches and cathedrals and things, they often have imagery of mermaids. They nearly always have a mirror on a comb, and it's to highlight how vain they are. So they're usually a caution against sort of vanity and lust and, things like that. So while a lot of people use the terms interchangeably now, technically speaking, they are actually two different types of creature. Although I don't know if I'd necessarily call mermaids mythological, because they appear in folklore in so many places, but sirens definitely come from Greek mythology.
So they are different entities then. That's the answer. So, and what about the ghosts then? I know that you are working on them for your PhD, but more in film studies. But in terms of the folklore, what can you tell us about ghosts? The different types of ghosts and the beliefs around them, even the practices around them.
The ghosts are really interesting because they change over time, and they almost become whatever the society that produces them needs them to be. And if you look at sort of the first kind of recorded ghost story, is the one, I want to say it's Pliny the Younger writes this one down, and it's about this guy who keeps hearing a ghost, sort of like, well, he keeps hearing rattling chains in his house. And one day he eventually follows the figure, and there's this guy just like pointing at a spot of. So the guy actually has it dug up and then discovers a skeleton, and they have the skeleton buried properly, and then the haunting ceases. So it's kind of like one of those restless spirits can't rest until they're interred properly kind of stories. And you see that one time and again, sort of through, I guess, sort of folklore, but it also appears in popular culture. Most Victorian writers had a crack at writing ghost stories at some stage, and you end up with it again. This idea. There's a long history of twinning the ghost story with the detective story, but then you also have the story, the ghost story who comes back with unfinished business or can't leave until something is done. There's a really strange strand of ghost stories, and I know it's in the Welsh tradition because of Delyth Badder and Mark Norman's forthcoming book about Welsh ghosts, but I know this is also a thing in the Northeast as well. Like, a person who, say, buries treasure and then dies before they can tell anyone where it is will come back as a ghost and more or less guide people to the treasure, and they can't move on until they've sort of handed it over, which is a really bizarre one that doesn't seem to have lasted in the same way. But yeah, then of course it leads to all kinds of really interesting stories, like the famous one with the Red Barn murders, where a woman was murdered and buried in the barn, and then her stepmother started claiming to be dreaming of a ghost and things, and it sort of led to this huge sensation and this huge interest in ghosts as then seeking justice for whatever had happened to them. So yeah, there's a whole like gamut of things that ghosts represent, depending at which point in time you're looking at them.
And what about haunted houses? How has that changed over time if you looked at it in your study?
I mean, I would say that they've changed, obviously, because I'm just looking at from 1979 onwards. I mean, even then they've changed because, you know, if you look at the film, like, we'll look at films in general because actually that's probably easier. But if you look at films from, say, the 60s, it's all about that. Is the house actually haunted, or is the character just having some kind of psychiatric episode? And then earlier ones, like The Ghost Goes West, the ghost is very much played for laughs, like it's a comedy type thing. And a lot of the time, the house is like a big old rambling, like probably Gothic house. And then obviously over time, that then becomes like the suburban house or the apartment and so on. And it kind of starts becoming like where ordinary people might encounter them. Obviously, you've got notable examples, like, I guess to an extent you could call The Shining a haunted house story. It's just the house is a whopping great hotel. But I think that part of the thing, again, with haunted houses is if you look at sort of the way that they even appear in folklore, sometimes it's somebody comes in and has to right a previous wrong because they've discovered something in the house that relates to a previous crime. Other times it's, you know, that they've got some kind of link to the house that they then need to reckon with. So there's almost a therapeutic aspect, I think, to the haunted house in particular. I mean, in the films I'm looking at, a lot of the time they appear at points when there's like an issue with the economy, which sounds weird. But Rebecca Duncan talks about how you can use the Gothic as a barometer for how well the economy's doing, and you get more.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah,
Tell
it's
me
just
about
sort
it.
of talks about the way that like the Gothic sort of charts economic turbulence, I think she puts it. And it's really interesting because you look at a lot of the films and you do sort of notice that they kind of disappear to an extent at times when people feel relatively secure, and then they reappear when people feel a little bit more, ooh, not quite sure what's going on. So you get these points throughout time where these films become really, really popular. And obviously, you know, there's also the aspect that Hollywood see something did well and it'll just do it to death. But in general, the films do sort of kind of correspond to moments where there's been some kind of issue. I think it was Stephen King who referred to the Amityville Horror as being the first economic horror, where the fact that they can't leave the house is because it's all the money's tied up in it because they've bought it at auction, but it's still too. No, they haven't bought it at auction. They've bought it at a rock down price because of the murders that were committed there. But they still can't leave when everything kicks off. It's that idea that like you're tied to this property that you cannot leave. So that there is quite an interesting kind of strand, but that's mostly American horror. I haven't really looked at horror elsewhere to see if that sort of plays out in other territories as well.
That's very interesting. I've never heard of that. I'd be interested in looking more into the literature and relation between the Gothic and economic instability. Apparently, I'm just wondering whether it's something that you can actually see, or it's more something that what's the term? Sort of a confirmation bias, where when you're trying to look at a reason and you fish for one. I'm not sure, but yeah, I haven't looked into that yet.
I think it's one of those things with the films where, as I say, it can be really tempting to be like, oh, this happened like a year after so and such, it must be linked. But then at the same time, you've also got to bear in mind the fact that there's all the time in pre-production before the film was ever thought of and conceived, and then it was in production and then post-production. So sometimes it's kind of like just because a film came out a year after something doesn't necessarily mean it's responding to it, because sometimes it can have been in the works for a couple of years before the thing ever happened. So, and that's why I'm so interested in the actual filmmaking aspect of it, because I'm sort of sitting there going, yeah, no, that's literally just because of how long it takes to make a film. It's not actually saying anything.
Yeah. I think these things are fascinating. It's always important to remember the correlation is not causation. So that's why it's not enough to see that certain things occur around the same time. You also need to find a causational link. that you can actually claim it, that the two things are linked in a causal way. Which something it is something that it's easy to miss sometimes. Not that I'm claiming that people that have that put forth that argument are making this kind of mistake, because I haven't read anything about it. So I'm just pointing out that it's something to consider when we look at arguments of any sort.
Yeah, I think the obviously there's way more to go into than I can here, but I think when you look at the Gothic as a mode, even when it came out, it sort of comes out of a very particular point in time. And I think that it's interesting for me because when you look at a lot of the way that the Gothic develops, you can sort of see sort of some of it even related to kind of the popular interest in things like collecting folklore and people writing ghost stories and things. So to me, they all kind of feed into each other in a way, but probably not in a way that like just an ordinary person in the street who was celebrating like the Harvest Festival, for example, probably wasn't interested in, because this is the problem as well. You don't want to start forcing, you know, your ideas about like an economic change like the Industrial Revolution onto people, you know, without sort of like properly looking at all the moving parts to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was wondering, of all these elements of folklore that you have addressed so far, do you think that in contemporary paganism these are reshaped in a different way compared to how they appear in folklore? And is there a specific pattern that you can see in how things are reshaped in contemporary paganism?
I think the only thing that really sort of springs to mind is it's not so much about them being reshaped. I think it's more about them becoming almost fixed. So if somebody, for example, has maybe they've got a family tradition, we'll use that as an example. So someone's got a family tradition for having a particular thing for a particular celebration. So, you know, a particular type of bread, for example, for Lammas or something like that. And that's their tradition that comes from what they've always done or what their family have done for as far back as is necessary. But then once people then start to write about it, somebody else might never have spoken to them, so they might then look at folklore and go, oh well, these people in the late 19th century did this, so that's what all the people did. And then it kind of gets written down and becomes fixed as like the way to celebrate something or to honor something. And I think that is possibly just the drawback of writing things down, that the minute that it then gets kind of written down and published, it sort of gets codified in a way that isn't necessarily flexible enough to take into account the fact that that's one snapshot from one moment in time. So you get this with folklore in general, that you might share a practice that a particular set of people in a particular region had, but that's only indicative of where that was collected. So even some of the folklore from the Northeast, like I've got a couple of things that have been collected in Newcastle itself, but you can't guarantee that that was also the case in Sunderland, for example, which is technically just down the road. But some people might just then expand that out and go, oh, that the whole of the Northeast did that. And that, I think, is part of the potential pitfall, I'll call it, because it's not a problem. It's just something to be aware of, that if you've got a family tradition for something and then you read in a book that actually this particular celebration or part of the wheel of the year or whatever requires this, but you actually are like, well, my family do this, then it's kind of having that space to be able to go, well, I'm going to stick to the family tradition, not what the book says. So I think that, you know, using folklore as a basis is helpful, and I think it's really good that people are looking to folklore and so on, but I just think that it's also a case of just remember that you can be flexible with these things.
Yeah, I think the idea of codifying, and also the idea that things become a bit prescriptive, especially on social media, I find that is the case, that often people tell each other, oh, this is the right way of doing this, or this is the right way of doing that, this is the true or the false, or there are always these types of dichotomies in social media. So I think that there is definitely, I agree that there's an element of codification and being a bit prescriptive about what to do with things. I was also wondering, do you also feel like there is a romanticizing and perhaps even a sanitizing of certain elements of folklore in contemporary paganism in the way they are incorporated in the beliefs and practices?
I think there's potential for that, depending on what the practice is. I think one of the the things that I think I find a little bit frustrating, if that's the right word, is when people, it's not so much sanitizing, it's more people just believe without questioning. So when you look at sort of folklore or just history itself, and you look at, for example, the way that witches traditionally presented and the way that they were treated and things like that, but people still persist in believing that all of these were just women, they were healers, they were midwives, and you kind of go, that's not actually, history doesn't necessarily hold that up as being true. And people will insist on continuing to believe a particular narrative that has been bandied about in sort of, say, popular witchcraft books since the 70s or whatever, because nobody's ever actually interrogated where that came from and whether that was true. And then because it just keeps getting repeated by each new generation, it almost then creates this legend that people then continue to kind of perpetuate, regardless of whether it actually has any historical basis or not. And I don't know how helpful that is. But I suppose one of the downsides that you've got in general is because paganism is not like taught in the same way that other religions are, people have to find the information where they can. So obviously you can't expect people to vet all of their sources when they're sort of picking up a book in the favorite bookshop or whatever, or choosing who to follow on social media. So I think it is difficult, but I think that's possibly also more a question of information literacy than a problem with folklore or indeed paganism itself. I think it just, again, it comes back to that idea of flexibility, of updating your knowledge about something when you learn something new. So if you learn after reading a book, or actually, witches weren't necessarily the way that they've been portrayed, I'll update what I know about that. And I think that would probably be a more useful mindset for people, that it's okay to go, oh, I used to know this, but now I know that. And it's okay to know both of them. So it's that sense of having a both and perspective rather than an either or.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that even with my project at Angela Symposium, I tend to highlight, because on one end I could say, oh, you can follow my work because it's based on academic peer-reviewed scholarship, but I think that is not what I want. I don't want people to be dependent on me. I want people to understand that there is a certain methodology that they can learn so that they can tell themselves whether a source is reliable or not. And I think that's way more important, to be honest, to understand the methodology. And I think something that is very, very simple is just look at the sources. It's something that people sometimes don't think about. And now I have all of my friends are traumatized, and every time they say, "Oh, I've read this in the book," and it's like, "What's the source? where where has the author got that information?" And they're like, "Oh, I don't know." And obviously, if it is a book that is experiential, where the author, for instance, if it is a practitioner, they are sharing their view of things, that's fine. I mean, that's obviously understandable. But you very often find books in the bookstores of people that are explaining to you entire cultures or how a certain tradition works, and they don't provide any references. I mean, even saying I've learned this from a teacher and I'm presenting to you what I've learned, that would be understandable. Of course, you take it with a big grain of salt, because it's, it's just another person. But at least, it's information. Then you can take into account what's the source, and you balance the information when you acquire it. Whereas I find that many books literally just throw around things about, oh, this tradition works this way and this other way, or even they really a pet peeve of mine is when you find percentages, and like it sounds like it comes from a survey, but there's nothing mentioned as a reference, like, oh, 70% of women, for instance, believe this and that, and there is no reference of the source. This happens, of course, on social media all the time, but I've also seen it happen in magazines, in books, in blog articles. So that's like a massive pet peeve of mine. I mean, it's bad enough when you are delivering information without citing any sources whatsoever, but it's even worse when you are presenting it as percentages and as if it comes from a statistical study that you, of course, are not mentioning because you're just making it up because it just furthers whatever is your agenda. So that really bothers me a lot. But I see that on social media all the time. So people, if you follow people on social media that throw around percentages and numbers and information without telling you the source, I would strongly advise you to take it with not a massive grain of salt, but more like with all the salt that you have in your home. Yeah, I wouldn't trust
Yeah,
that kind of source.
yeah, the whole lack of sources thing, or when people present things, it's like, oh, this is just accepted fact, and I'm like, says who?
Yeah.
is one of my things. Yeah.
Yeah. Another pet peeve of mine is when people say scholars believe that, and then you have no mention of the scholars, no reference. It's like, who are these scholars? Do they exist? Are they part of your imagination? This is something that students do all the time. So it's something that I see in students' essays all the time. Scholars say, scholars agree. So when I see online, it kind of triggers my lecturer side marking students' assignments. But yeah, I think that it's really important to get into the mindset where you check the sources, and that doesn't mean that it only needs to be a reliable academic source. I mean, as I said, it can also be something experiential. It comes from the experience of somebody. As long as you say it, as long as you make it plain that it is your experience or it's your interpretation, that's fine. I just have a problem with people delivering things as if that's the truth, or the agreed upon knowledge, and then it's not, and there is no reference to that. So that bothers me. Sorry, I just went off tangent.
It's a good point, though. You do get this quite a lot. And I think one of the problems with folklore with that is it's an oral tradition a lot of the time. So, like one of the advantages that you get with folklore on social media, somebody might sort of say, oh, my gran always told me. And then they'll tell, cool, awesome. We know where that came from. We don't know where she got it from, but we know where you got it from. But yeah, so I think because of the nature of folklore, people are a little bit better at saying where they got the thing, because it's okay to say, like the man in the chip shop said, because that's still part of folklore. But yeah, I think with some of the paganism things, that I've seen some really highly questionable things in books, and there was one book I nearly threw across the room because I was like, well, that's just completely wrong. It's historically wrong, and I don't understand how you came to that conclusion. But then when you looked in the back, no bibliography, no references, no further reading, no nothing. So I have no idea where this woman got any of her information from, or if it was just from Instagram slides.
Yeah, because nowadays it can very well be the case. This made me laugh. Ray saying Angela's secretly grading YouTubers on their math. Oh yes, no. And then Dr. Puka's Italian fairy angel blood is boiling, and we love it. Yeah, it boils when there are no references. So.
Well, that's a big thing. I always make sure I do. Like, I always have my list of references at the end of a blog post. And like, I just did a book for DK, and there's no references, but I'd still say where something came from in the text itself. So I still name the people that because obviously it's a different kind of market. It's not an academic book. But like I put the references on for two reasons. One is so I'm like, this is where it came from. And two is if someone's really interested in the topic, they can then like they've now got extra sources that they can then go and have a look at. So it's kind of like rather than someone having to say, where should I start? There you go. There's a whole reading list. Have fun. And I think it's not that hard to do. You know, you might not necessarily want to use like Harvard referencing, but even just naming the book would be helpful.
Yeah, it's not hard to do if you actually read books for your information. Whereas if you're just making stuff up, of course it's gonna be difficult to mention your sources. You can tell that it's a pet peeve of mine. And yes, this is another thing, Zachary. Studies show, and it's common sense, without mentioning studies. This is like very common on social media, unfortunately. But the fact that I also found it in books, it's appalling in my opinion. I remember very clearly this. My best friend was showing me a book on, I think it was, he's very passionate about Afro-Brazilian traditions. And this book, I think, was on Umbanda. And, I was just going through the book and, there was all the explanation of all the parts of the traditions and all the deities and there was no reference, no bibliography, nothing. And it's like, so where is this author getting all of this? Has he dreamt it? Has he hallucinated it? Has he just, one day woke up and said, "Oh, yeah, let me just." And obviously, I am not particularly knowledgeable on that subject, so I couldn't tell whether the information was accurate or not. But just the sheer fact that there was no source whatsoever for me was already a no.
I mean, it's not too bad if someone's at least got like a recommended reading list because you kind of feel like they've looked at something. But yeah, I think this is one of the things that I sort of find with some not all, some of the contemporary paganism is the fact that at least some authors will say, this all comes from my practice. This is how I do it. This is my experience. Here you go. Do what you want with it. And I've actually kind of got a bit more respect for that approach because of the fact that they're saying, this is literally what I do. Like to me, that's not really that different from like cookbooks and things. Whereas, when people are trying to then give like the historical section and there's no references, and I'm like, a casual Wikipedia search would show that a lot of that is wrong. So, that's always a bit.
And Wikipedia does better because it actually has sources. And Arcane Whisker says dreams are technically a primary source. Yeah, that's a good point. But as I said, I'm not against these type of things. For me, it's just about mentioning where the information comes from so that people can have a proper assessment.
Yeah.
So sorry about the tangent.
That's funny.
Just, talking about sources just triggers me. But so is there anything else that you'd like my audience to know about the subject of today's episode and interview before we wrap up?
I think I genuinely think that people can get something out of folklore, however they choose to approach it. And I say that because I once asked on Twitter, just, how you sometimes ask a random question and it ends up taking off. And I just asked people like, what brought you to folklore? And the answers were really interesting. And I did actually categorize them into sort of like different types. And some people were brought to folklore by the fact that like a parent might have told them the stories from like their culture or whatever as a child, which was really lovely. Or other people had just always been interested. How some kids just find a thing really early on and then that's the thing. That would be me. And they just always really loved it, but didn't necessarily know it had a name. But the one that really, really stuck out to me was the people who found it helped connect them to a sense of place. So whenever they went anywhere new, they would make it their business to like go and learn some of the folklore about that place, because then they felt when they got there that they had a bit more of a feel for like the personality of the place rather than just like what TripAdvisor said. And they sort of felt more comfortable in that place because they had like an awareness of its folklore. Because I suppose in some ways folklore is kind of a little bit like a form of cultural memory for a place. So I think that's where I genuinely think that everybody can get something out of folklore, even if it's looking at where you live, if it's looking at where you're from. I mean, obviously, I'm fortunate that I live where I'm from, but I've got such a stronger connection to where I'm from because of the fact that obviously I've taken the time to like read its history and like learn its folklore and so on. And I know when I lived in London, it was the same. I'm such a geek. I used to go off on like little history walks around the area and kind of get to know again the stories. And there's so many weird things going on in London that like there's something unusual pretty much everywhere. But it just made you feel more rooted in that place. So I think that would be my thing, that I think everybody can take something away from folklore, because it connects you into that, and it connects you into other people as well. So it's things like ask your elderly relatives about things that they used to do when they were younger. Ask them for family recipes and so on, because it all just becomes a really interesting way of like getting in touch with like information that's like pertinent to you. And because folklore includes family traditions, I think it's a really nice way. And obviously, family can be found family. It can be adopted family. It doesn't have to be blood relations, but just the people you want to connect with. Sort of like learning about their traditions and so on. Again, can be a really nice, easy way, and a fun way. I think in some ways, particularly if it involves food, of getting to know sort of how stories and people intersect.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's from the way you're saying it, it sounds like getting interested in the folklore of the place that you live in makes you connect with the spirits of the place in a way.
Very much so.
Sounds like a nice note to end our interview. So where can people find you, Icy?
Oh, I'm on pretty much every social media platform, including all the new ones that no one fully knows how to use yet. As I usually at Icy Sedgwick, or obviously my website is icysedgwick.com. And I've got my podcast, Fabulous Folklore, which is on pretty much as many platforms as I can think of, or just good old-fashioned YouTube, and you can just subscribe there, and it'll then notify you every time I put an episode up. So I'm basically like everywhere in a really annoying kind of way, I think, with some people.
It's better to annoy people with folklore than with information without references. So thank you so much.
I'm going to come off this and I'm going to go through my entire PhD bibliography just to check it now.
I'm sorry. I hope that it wasn't meant, as like that, but it's just a pet peeve of mine. I just can't help it. But thank you so much for being here, Icy, and I recommend everybody to check out your Fabulous Folklore podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely being here.
Thank you again. So, thank you all so much for having participated in this interview. And whether you're watching this live or you're watching it afterwards, and if you, of course, liked this interview, please don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell because otherwise YouTube might not notify you when I upload a new video. Also, leave me a comment so that I know what you thought about the interview, whether you have any questions. And also remember that the best way to be in contact with me, if you want to communicate with me more, because I tend to get quite a few messages from you guys, which is fantastic, but I really interact only with my patrons. So if you want to have a longer type of interaction with me, I would really recommend to become a patron or a supporter. Any type of support really would get you access to getting in contact with me and having a conversation with me if that's what you're interested in. So thank you all for being here, and stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.